Back in the distant, optimistic days of the late 1950s, when America was locked in a space race with the Soviet Union, and the Cold War was less a metaphor and more a very real, very terrifying daily reality, someone at the United States Air Force sat down and asked a question that seemed, at the time, perfectly reasonable. What if we built a bomber so fast, so high, and so unstoppable, that no enemy fighter, no missile, and no radar in the world could ever touch it? The answer, as it turned out, was the North American XB-70 Valkyrie. A machine so breathtaking, so audacious, and so deeply, magnificently over-engineered, that even today aviation engineers speak about it in hushed, reverent tones, the way art lovers talk about a painting they can never quite believe exists. But here is the twist in the story. By the time the Valkyrie actually flew for the first time, the entire reason for building it had already evaporated. The world had changed around it. Technology had made it obsolete before it ever had the chance to be useful. And a single catastrophic afternoon in the skies over California would seal its fate forever. This is the story of the jet that was too fast to use. Background: the problem in the sky. To understand the Valkyrie, you have to understand the world that created it. The year is 1954. The Korean War has just ended. The Soviet Union has tested its first hydrogen bomb. And the United States Air Force has a problem. At the time, the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent was the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. A magnificent aircraft, no question. Big, powerful, capable of carrying nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory. But the B-52 had one glaring weakness that kept generals awake at night. It was slow. Not slow by everyday standards, the B-52 cruised at around 650 miles per hour, which is nothing to laugh at. But compared to what Soviet interceptor jets and, increasingly, surface-to-air missiles were capable of, the B-52 was essentially a very large, very expensive target. The thinking at the time went something like this: if you fly high enough and fast enough, nothing can catch you. Interceptor jets of the era had service ceilings and speed limits. Missiles were still relatively primitive. A bomber that could cruise at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, at an altitude of 70,000 feet would be, for all practical purposes, untouchable. And so, in 1955, the United States Air Force issued a request for what it called a Weapon System 110A, a next-generation strategic bomber that could replace the B-52 entirely. It needed to fly at Mach 3. It needed to reach altitudes above 70,000 feet. It needed intercontinental range. And it needed to carry nuclear weapons. North American Aviation won the contract. And they got to work on something that had never been attempted before in aviation history. The design, engineering the impossible. Here is where things get genuinely extraordinary. Because designing an aircraft to fly at Mach 3 is not simply a matter of making something faster. It is, in every meaningful sense, a completely different engineering problem from anything that had come before. At 3 times the speed of sound, the air in front of your aircraft behaves less like a fluid and more like a wall. The friction heat generated on the airframe is so intense that conventional aluminum, the standard material of aircraft construction at the time, would literally soften and lose its structural integrity. The Valkyrie would have to be built from stainless steel and titanium, materials that were expensive, difficult to work with, and which no one had ever used to build an aircraft of this size. The plane that emerged from the North American design team was unlike anything the world had seen. The XB-70 was enormous, 196 feet long, with a wingspan of 105 feet and a weight at takeoff of nearly 550,000 pounds. It was, at the time, one of the largest aircraft ever designed to fly faster than sound. It had 6 enormous General Electric YJ-93 engines mounted side by side beneath the fuselage, producing a combined thrust of around 180,000 pounds. To put that into perspective, each engine individually produced more thrust than the entire power plant of a Boeing 707 airliner. But the most visually striking feature of the Valkyrie was its canard delta configuration. The plane had a sharp, needle-like nose, a massive delta wing stretching across its midsection, and a pair of small canard fins at the front. The 6 engines were fed by a single enormous rectangular intake underneath the fuselage. When you look at a photograph of the XB-70, it does not look like an aircraft that was designed in the 1950s. It looks like something from a science fiction film set in the far future. And then there were the wingtips. North Americans engineers discovered something remarkable during their wind tunnel testing. At very high speeds, an aircraft generates powerful shock waves beneath its wings. If you could somehow surf those shock waves, ride the compressed air that your own speed was generating, you could dramatically reduce drag and improve fuel efficiency. They called it compression lift, and it had never been used on any production aircraft before. The solution was to fold the wingtips downward, by as much as 65 degrees at high speed. This would capture the shock waves beneath the delta wing, effectively letting the Valkyrie ride its own bow wave across the sky. It was one of the most elegant pieces of aerodynamic engineering ever conceived. And it actually worked. The numbers, what it could actually do. When the XB-70 finally flew in September 1964, nearly a decade after the original design contract was awarded, the numbers it produced were staggering. At altitude, the Valkyrie could sustain a cruise speed of Mach 3.1, roughly 2,000 miles per hour. It had a service ceiling of 77,350 feet, putting it well above the effective range of any surface-to-air missile system then in Soviet hands. Its combat range was over 3,700 miles without refueling, and with aerial refueling it could reach essentially anywhere on the planet. The heat generated by its speed was so intense that the skin of the aircraft would reach temperatures of over 330 degrees Celsius during sustained high-speed flight. The airframe would actually grow slightly longer, by several inches, as the stainless steel expanded under the heat. The cockpit had to be actively cooled to keep the pilots alive. At Mach 3, the Valkyrie was covering roughly half a mile every second. Flying from New York to London would have taken it under 2 hours. A mission from a base in the United States into the heart of the Soviet Union and back again was, in theory, achievable in a single long day. It was, by any measure, the most capable strategic bomber ever built. There was nothing like it in the skies. And there has been nothing quite like it since. The problem, the world that changed underneath it. And now we come to the cruel irony at the heart of the Valkyrie story. You see, while North Americans' engineers were spending years solving the extraordinary technical challenges of Mach 3 flight, the strategic and technological landscape that had made the Valkyrie necessary was quietly, relentlessly changing. The specific threat that the Valkyrie had been designed to evade, Soviet interceptor jets, was being rapidly superseded by a different threat entirely. Intercontinental ballistic missiles. ICBMs. Weapons that did not need to intercept a bomber at all, because they flew higher, faster, and more destructively than any aircraft ever could. And at the same time, Soviet surface-to-air missile technology was advancing far faster than American analysts had predicted. In May 1960, a CIA U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, flying at 70,000 feet, the same altitude the Valkyrie was designed to operate at, was shot down over the Soviet Union by an SA-2 missile. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, survived. But the assumption that altitude alone meant safety died with his mission. If a relatively slow U-2 could be shot down at 70,000 feet, what hope did a massive, extremely visible bomber have, regardless of how fast it was flying? The answer that military planners were increasingly arriving at was, not much. The logic that had driven the entire Valkyrie program, fly high, fly fast, be untouchable, had been comprehensively undermined before the plane ever left the ground. By 1961, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was already questioning whether the XB-70 program made strategic sense. The United States was investing enormous resources in developing ICBMs that could deliver nuclear warheads more reliably, more cheaply, and with less risk to human life than any manned bomber. The Valkyrie was beginning to look less like the future of air power and more like an extraordinarily expensive solution to a problem that no longer existed. The program was scaled back. The original plan for dozens of operational aircraft was reduced to just 2 flying prototypes, kept alive largely for research purposes rather than any serious intention to deploy them in combat. The accident, one perfect, terrible day. By the summer of 1966, the 2 XB-70 prototypes had been flying for nearly 2 years. They had accumulated an impressive body of research data and had demonstrated that sustained Mach 3 cruise was genuinely achievable. The Air Force and NASA were using the flights to gather information about supersonic aerodynamics, high-altitude atmospheric conditions, and the behavior of materials under sustained thermal stress. On June 8, 1966, the second XB-70 prototype, Air Vehicle 2, as it was officially designated, took off from Edwards Air Force Base in California for what was, on the surface, a fairly routine research flight. But it had been decided to mark the occasion with a formation photo shoot. General Electric, which had built the Valkyrie's engines, wanted promotional photographs of their engines in action. And so the XB-70 flew in a tight formation with 5 other aircraft, an F-104 Starfighter, an F-5, a T-38 Talon, a B-58 Hustler, and an F-104 chase plane. For most of the flight, everything went smoothly. The photographs were taken. The formation was tight and impressive, the Valkyrie enormous and silver against the blue California sky, the smaller jets arranged around it like an honor guard. And then, in a matter of seconds, everything went wrong. One of the F-104 starfighters, piloted by NASA test pilot Joe Walker, moved too close to the Valkyrie. At low speed and in close formation, the XB-70 generated powerful vortices, spiraling columns of disturbed air, off its massive delta wing. Walker's F-104 was caught in one of these vortices. The small jet flipped inverted, rolled across the top of the Valkyrie, and struck the bomber's twin-tail fins. The collision was catastrophic. Walker's F-104 exploded instantly. Joe Walker was killed. The XB-70, with its twin vertical tails sheared off and one of its wings severely damaged, flew on for several more seconds in a controlled attitude before beginning to break apart. The co-pilot, Major Carl Cross, was also killed when his ejection seat failed to function correctly after he finally managed to eject. The pilot, Al White, ejected successfully but sustained serious injuries. Air Vehicle 2 was gone. And with it, in many ways, the last serious argument for the Valkyrie's future. The aftermath, what was left behind. The remaining prototype, Air Vehicle 1, continued flying research missions until February 1969, accumulating a total of 83 flights and providing an invaluable body of data on supersonic aerodynamics and high-altitude flight. It was then retired and donated to the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where it remains on display today. It is, by any account, one of the most visually arresting aircraft ever put on public display. Visitors who encounter it for the first time invariably stop and stare. Because it simply does not look like it belongs to the era in which it was built. It looks like a machine from the future that somehow ended up in the past. The total cost of the XB-70 program, by the time it was finally wound down, was approximately $1.5 billion, equivalent to well over $10 billion in today's money. 2 airframes were built. Neither ever carried a weapon in anger. Neither ever flew an operational mission. The aircraft that was supposed to be the cornerstone of American nuclear deterrence for the next generation served only as a research platform and a photographic subject. And yet the Valkyrie's story is not simply one of waste and failure. Because the data gathered during its flights was not wasted. The lessons learned about sustained supersonic cruise, about the behavior of advanced materials under extreme thermal stress, about compression lift and canard aerodynamics, all of it fed directly into subsequent American aerospace programs. The Concorde program, developed in parallel in Europe, benefited from similar research. NASA's supersonic transport research drew heavily on XB-70 data. The aerodynamic principles that the Valkyrie pioneered can be traced forward in a direct line to aircraft that came after it. Why it still matters, the lesson of the Valkyrie. So why are we still talking about the XB-70 Valkyrie? Why, more than 60 years after it first flew, does it continue to fascinate engineers, historians, and aviation enthusiasts alike? Part of the answer is simply that it is beautiful. There are aircraft that function well, and there are aircraft that inspire. The Valkyrie is rare in that it does both, or rather, it very nearly does both, which is perhaps even more poignant. But the deeper reason the Valkyrie matters is because its story is a perfect, almost textbook illustration of a problem that recurs throughout the history of technology, warfare, and industrial development. The problem of building for the world as it is today, in a future that has already moved on. The Valkyrie was the right answer to the right question. The question was, how do you build a strategic bomber that can penetrate Soviet airspace in 1960? The answer was, fly high, fly fast, be impossible to intercept. The XB-70 was, by every technical measure, the perfect embodiment of that answer. But by the time you can actually build the answer, the question has changed. ICBMs had made manned bombers a secondary deterrent. Surface-to-air missiles had made altitude and speed insufficient protection. The strategic logic that had driven the entire program had been overtaken by events before the first rivet was ever struck. This is not a lesson unique to aviation. It appears again and again throughout history, from warships rendered obsolete by new weapons before they could be launched, to computer systems designed for problems that software had already solved by the time the hardware arrived. The Valkyrie is simply one of the purest and most dramatic examples of the phenomenon. And perhaps most painfully of all, the Valkyrie was not a failure of engineering. It was not a failure of vision. It was a failure of timing. The people who built it were some of the most talented aerospace engineers who ever lived. What they created was genuinely extraordinary. It just arrived in a world that had already found a different answer to its most pressing questions. Conclusion: what could have been? There is a version of history in which the XB-70 Valkyrie entered full production in the mid-1960s, in which fleets of silver Mach 3 bombers flew high-alert missions above the clouds, in which the audacious engineering gamble of compression lift and folding wingtips became a standard feature of American air power for a generation. It did not happen that way. The ICBMs came. The surface-to-air missiles came. Robert McNamara came, with his economists and his cost-benefit analyses and his entirely reasonable questions about whether spending billions on a manned bomber still made sense when you could spend far less on a missile that flew faster, further, and more reliably. And on a warm afternoon in June 1966, over the Mojave Desert, a small F-104 drifted too close to an enormous delta wing, and the most spectacular aircraft ever built by human hands began its final, uncontrolled descent toward the California floor. The surviving prototype sits today in a museum in Ohio. Children walk around it on school trips, craning their necks up at its needle nose and vast wing, asking their teachers what it is. And the answer, that it was a bomber so fast that nothing could catch it, built for a war that was fought with missiles instead of aircraft, tested with research flights instead of combat missions, and ultimately grounded by a formation photograph gone horribly wrong, is so strange, so dramatic, and so deeply human in its mixture of brilliance and tragedy, that it almost doesn't seem real. But it is real. And if you ever find yourself in Dayton, Ohio, you can stand next to it and know that it is real. Thanks so much for reading today. I hope you enjoyed this tale about the most spectacular aircraft never truly used, and what could have been. If this kind of deep dive into aviation history is your thing, stay around. There are plenty more stories where this one came from. Take care.